Well, welcome everybody to the Premier Living Podcast. My name is William Marsh. I'm the Director of Education here at Premier Research Labs, and I'm so excited to be joined with our Technical Director now, Nathan Jodge. He was our R&D Manager, now Technical Director. But Nathan, it is always a pleasure.
It is wonderful to be here with you, Will, as always.
Honor. We are wanting to really go into the topic of why supplements are a requirement in this day and age. I think it's something really important. We are a dietary supplement manufacturer. We're not just trying to do this topic because we are a manufacturer of dietary supplements. It's really because people need to understand the quality of food that they're eating and how, with agricultural policies and really where the state of the world is today. And, we talk about lifestyle strategies or facets of lifestyle that impact consumers. You really need to have supplements. And I think, having that conversation and being honest about that and maybe transparent where people don't necessarily understand the food supply really can help people maybe see the light of why products of premier quality that really support health systems can really support the body towards ideal health. So Nathan, would you like to share some thoughts on that?
Sure, absolutely. And I have many thoughts on this. The question is really, where do we start? So I think most people who are sort of in the know, if you will, about the state of the food supply in the world today are probably aware of the fact that, because this gets trumpeted so frequently in journal articles, news articles, that the actual nutritional value of food over the last 52 and definitely to 100 years has actually degraded significantly. And there's a lot of facets to this, a lot of reasons for this. You look at really it's the problem again is really it's the human choices that get us there. So different reasons for those choices, of course, but the state of the soil, for example. I mean, I always start with the soil. Everything starts with the soil. Let's be honest here. We say start at the ground level. Well, that's the ground level, right? And really slightly below maybe the ground level, where the roots are going to go and pull nutrients. And if you look at the quality of soils around the world, I've seen a number of figures on this, but basically they all fall around this number that something like more than 50% of soils across the world are essentially depleted of nutrients. They're in a dangerous state. And you think about where this comes from and that when you're growing crops, plants are going to pull their nutrients out of the soil. So they're going to pull the nutrients from the soil. You have to somehow replace the nutrients that are taken up by the plants. The more plants you grow, commercial growing, for example, in commercial agriculture, the more nutrients those plants are going to pull out of the soil, so the less nutrients will be available. Well, of course, in the last 100 years or so, we've gone to chemical fertilization. And strictly speaking, chemical fertilization, so you look at things what you buy on the shelf that has an NPK value, for example, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Those are only 3 nutrients. And yes, while they're incredibly important to the growth of a plant, you have to think that those three nutrients are not supplying everything else.
Yeah, so maybe for the audience, defining what's going to start to be missing in the soil.
Right. So think about that you're using these chemical fertilizers. They're really just giving these 3, and they're just ions essentially. So these 3 compounds that are providing ions to the plant to further its growth. But if you're only putting those 3 nutrients back in the soil every time you grow, eventually everything else. So think that soil is this rich mix of nutrients. Think about there's minerals in it. There are organic compounds that plants need to survive as well. Not to mention there's commensal microorganisms, bacteria, fungus. All of these things living in this rich ecosystem that provide other compounds to the plant. I mean, metabolites from the bacteria, from yeast, from other microorganisms go into the plant. The plant sucks them up through the roots, through the vacuoles. It goes into the rest of the plant, the leaf, the stem. These chemicals get changed, metabolized by the plant. So it's this continuing cycle of chemical production and alteration that provides this host of, in many cases, thousands of compounds. But if your soil is depleted, if your plants have grown and they've sucked up some nutrients, and then you go ahead and you clear them out, and you throw down some fertilizer, some chemical fertilizer that's only providing nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And again, these nutrients that they're putting in, or rather these minerals they're putting in, typically speaking, again, they're inorganics. So these are crystalline compounds that you're not probably going to normally find in high content in a soil. They're being put in, and so they're not providing anything additional. Nothing to feed those bacteria and those yeasts and other fungi that are growing beneath the surface. So they're being depleted of their nutrients as well. And so the next round of plants that you grow has even less of these naturally occurring compounds to suck up into its structure, and then when harvested provide that as nutrients to whoever's consuming it. And this cycle continues over and over and over again. So eventually you basically have nothing left in that soil. If you're not putting anything back to replace all these other chemicals, those things are just going to be gone for the most part. Yeah, some will find their way back. It does happen. I mean, obviously, you have let's see, movement of soils, you have deposition, you have the rainfall that moves things, but that is minimal. So in the end, you have to find a way to replace those nutrients. Now, there's a number of ways to do this, of course, but even organic fertilizers, which typically contain many more of these compounds, even those are not usually enough to really fully replace what has been lost. So because of this, as I stated before, and again, as is very apparent and very well known, the overall quality of soils has been just deteriorating over the last 100 or so years. And then, of course, that means that the food supply, which needs those nutrients from the soil, is also deteriorating.
So what are the practical implications of this depleted food supply that we're now experiencing?
Well, I mean, probably the things you see the most when you look at the studies that have been done, comparing nutritive value over the last 50, 60 years, right? You see pretty profound decreases in things like vitamin C, vitamin A, calcium, actually, some of the B vitamins. These numbers have been steadily decreasing to the point where, again, in some cases, you're seeing, 15, 20% differences just in 50 years in those compounds. And when you really think about it, think about how important things like vitamin A and vitamin C really are. I remember when I was a child that vitamin C was still very much everyone should be taking some extra vitamin C, whatever. But we don't think about the vitamin C content of foods themselves. And if you really do consider that, think about how getting your vitamin C from a plant-based format is so much better than, eating one of those stick packs of ascorbic acid. I would much rather eat berries and citrus fruit and greens to get my vitamin C than have to take in a synthetic vitamin just because I can no longer get that from my food.
Well, maybe for the audience, because we have a wonderful vitamin C that's sourced from amla fruit, and
we do.
Maybe help people understand what happens when you get vitamin C from a whole food source, right? And all the different cofactors and everything that goes with that.
Sure. So again, when you think about the way vitamin C is found in a plant, the vitamin C is not just there by itself. It's not like you took orange juice and you squeezed the orange and there was vitamin C and water in there. Obviously not. There's a lot of other phytonutrients that occur in the plant matrix that are brought along with that vitamin C. And a lot of these cofactors, when you think about it, it's things like flavanols, flavonoids, those are actually incredibly beneficial by themselves. But in conjunction with the vitamin C, there is really this additive effect. And it's sort of one of those situations where when you look at just taking a vitamin C supplement, so standalone, so just taking ascorbic acid or even an ascorbate, again, it's a good thing. It's providing with vitamin C. Typically, they have a pretty high absorption rate, almost regardless of the structure. But that is all you're getting. You're only getting the vitamin C. And really getting it from that plant matrix where you're having all of these other phytonutrients supplied, it's far more in tune with what you would have done 100+ years ago, getting all your nutrients from your food. And so having that is really, honestly, just a much, in my opinion, I'll use the term, it's a much more organic situation. And obviously I'm maybe making a little bit of a pun there on the term, but again, it's so much more in tune with a natural way of living and a natural way of providing all of the things that you need for a healthy life versus having to have all of these synthesized compounds sitting around and just, sort of taking them willy-nilly as you need them. And in many cases, taking too much, because there certainly is a point at which the body just certainly can't absorb more of these exogenous compounds. And even if it's not necessarily doing any harm, it's not doing you any additional good. So, why take those 1,000 or 1,500 or 10,000 milligrams of vitamin C, unless it's needed, of course. But if you can have a daily dose of it provided with all of the additional beneficial phytonutrients, that is just so much more sound that it to me seems like a no-brainer.
So I want to, in a second, we'll actually go into what actually can kind of manifest because you're not getting all those cofactors and beneficial, phytonutrients that goes along with those main micronutrients. But I want to talk about, a lot of people point to the fact that 50, 100 years ago, I'm going to be a devil's advocate here, that, the nutrients in the food supply was much more robust. And we cited why that's the case, right? And we know through industrial farming techniques and crop rotations or lack of crop rotations, right? That's depleting the soil. But there's also this access. Think about, I can go to the grocery store now and I can buy every food under the sun. 50, 100 years ago, that wasn't the case. And so how do we have this plethora of food, but based on the argument, the food that's actually in that store is less nutrient dense than if, let's just say, that farmer was only able to grow 20 or 30 vegetables. Is that the case? Is that the truth of the matter?
So what we've definitely seen in the last 100 years, and certainly the last 50 or 60, as if truly industrialized farming really took over, was the choice. And again, I keep saying that all this stuff comes down to human choices. There's consequences to your choices. And the choice was made for, well, let's face it, for profit. And if the choice is made for profit, then what you're going to look for is quantity, and quantity will degrade quality. So yes, you're going to produce a much larger harvest of whatever fruit or vegetable you're growing. But because of this, think about that. The soil is depleted. You're growing more of these things. More nutrients having to be spread across a larger harvest means that each individual item is going to have less of those nutrients. Because again, you're taking from it's a limited pool of nutrients there. It's now, instead of providing a harvest of 100 kilograms, now you're providing 1,000 kilograms, say. Okay, well, now you have a 10x decrease, essentially, in the amount of available nutrient in each plant. And that's the situation we face. And then, as I said, if you're not replacing those nutrients, then the next time you do this, that even gets degraded more. So it's that number is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking until what you're providing, there's nutrients there, but it's nowhere near what you would have had with a very healthy soil, a soil that was meant to support a certain amount of growth, rather than essentially being conditioned, if you will, to support the growth of more plants that are not necessarily growing well. You see this in a lot of the various cultivars that have been chosen over the years because of their prolific nature, rather than necessarily their nutritive value.
Could you define that a little bit? I think there's, maybe that's a really good point that you make, that it's not been natural selection of what's determined our food supply. Mm-hmm. And so talk to us a little bit about, how we've, as a species, selected foods for that prolific nature.
Sure. So, there's cause and consequence to all these things. And there is no doubt that if you're trying to feed more people, just to provide food, to provide calories, then certainly having more food available will meet that need. But calories without value, empty calories, as we I don't know if we even still use that term anymore. I use it because I'm older than a lot of people, but empty calories, that's no good. So yeah, I mean, I don't mind eating this, giant tomato that my plant now produces 5,000 giant tomatoes versus 20 smaller tomatoes. But if that giant tomato has nothing in it but sugar and water primarily, and just a very small amount of macro and micronutrients for me, what good has it done? That smaller tomato is going to provide me with a lot of vitamin C, a lot of vitamin A, a lot of lycopene. So it was going to give me better nutritive value. It's not that I don't need calories. Certainly I do. But there has to be that balance. You have to make sure you're getting the calories required to meet your energetic needs, but you also have to be getting the micro and macronutrients that provide the body with all of the other things that it needs, because you just don't need energy. You need to have cellular repair. You need to have the ability to produce enough of your own inherent proteins and enzymes, and they require coenzymes, and all of these things get provided with the richer diet that's high in nutritive value. Otherwise, I mean, we would all just move to a synthetic diet where we just have a generic amino acid, we have generic synthetic vitamins, and, it becomes this very dystopian future, in my opinion, and it's kind of scary. I would prefer to have healthy, delicious food over being forced, essentially, to say, no, everything I'm going to get is going to be provided by some sort of powder that they're going to mix into a drink for me, and I'm going to drink this daily, and it just keeps my body functioning rather than functioning optimally.
Yeah, it's really that. It's really what makes the difference between that just baseline, I'm moving through life and I'm okay, versus thriving and having that radiant health potential. Having this like food depleted experience, what does that maybe feel like? Because I think, there may be some listeners, and I know a lot of our practitioners are aware of this, right? But, somebody listening to this may have never even conceptualized, the importance of why looking at even beyond organic, which we'll talk about why organic's enough, but, what kind of manifests physiologically when you're not getting those cofactors and you're not getting all those beneficial additional nutrients that aren't just the micro minerals and the micronutrients and the macronutrients as well.
So I think one of the best ways to do this, and I don't necessarily advocate this for everybody to do, but it is an interesting experiment if you haven't ever done this. So I've done this myself, and I find it really interesting. But if you do a fast, so a short one, 24 to 48 hours fast, and then when you start reintroducing the nutrients, doing it in a very molecular way. So starting with things like, I'm going to take an amino acid powder, and I'm going to have that with a synthetic multivitamin. Try doing this and see how you feel. A good 24-hour fast is actually a wonderful feeling. Push it to the 48 hours, you get into that state where you really need to have some sort of nutrients put back in you. And it's almost like the feeling of getting an IV drip of saline when you're sick. You put these things in and it kind of brings you back, if you will, but you don't feel energetic. You don't feel, really the best way I can describe it is you just don't feel complete. You can function, but all you're able to do is function. You're able to get through what you need to get through. Try instead then doing the same fast, but after that, try introducing something like a broth instead of taking just amino acids and a multivitamin. Get a good broth, if possible, a bone broth, so that you're getting a good high quality protein, with lots of vegetables in it, and then have that instead and compare the two feelings. It actually is profound. And so eating a depleted diet is very much like that. Yes, you can get through your day eating mass-produced food. It provides you the calories you need. But feeling optimal, being able to go out and perform at a high level, I can tell you right now, I can't do that. I could not eat just a, what I'll call the commercial diet and then be able to function optimally. As an athlete, I can't do that. I mean, sure, you look at what they push, dietarily speaking, and I can't go out and eat a cheeseburger and fries and then go compete in mixed martial arts. I can tell you right now that won't happen. But I can definitely eat some fresh vegetables. I can eat a good, clean serving of protein, and then I can go compete, and I can feel perfectly fine.
Well, I would argue that mass-produced burger and fries probably isn't the one that would actually provide a level of support. But if you were getting truly nutrient dense, you were doing a blend of meat.
And that's just it. But,
right?
But think about that. What's available quickly is typically something that is mass-produced. Even going to the grocery store. Now, thankfully, in the last few years, there have been a lot more grocery stores trying to obtain as much as possible some, I'll call it sometimes boutique nonetheless, but these smaller farmed, higher nutrient value foods. So I'm glad that there are places that do that. Don't get me wrong, I think it's wonderful. But most people in the world don't have access to that. And certainly even in the United States, those kind of markets are not in every neighborhood, not even close. And so what you're left with is the mass-produced options, if there's even a good grocery store near you, or you're basically subjected to fast food, pre-prepared, indefinite shelf life preserved things. And you know that those are not going to provide the nutritive value you need. They will not. But that's what's available. So, again, people really have to be aware that supplementation is very quickly becoming an absolute necessity for so many people, because so many people don't have access to food with high nutritive value.
Well, and I think what we're really getting at is that level of resiliency in the body. And I think, this is where, when we look at drivers of chronic disease and, when we look at an aging population and people that want to live longer than ever, than in the history of humanity, right? You have to have those iterative nutrient layers that it comes from a whole food matrix, but a pristine whole food matrix at that really creates allows the body to have optimal function, and really, when the body's stress tested, right, it has that kind of that rebound layer from all the nutrients that come from a really good healthy diet, along with what's really now the requirement, which is supplements. And what's really beautiful is we here at Premier Research Labs, we do the whole food, like we're so big on whole food matrices. And maybe for the audience, defining even in our supplements, how we define quality to really further support that narrative of whole foods. Would you be willing to share?
Yeah, sure. So obviously when I think about some of the offerings that Premier Research Labs actually has, I think about things like our multivitamin, for example. It's a plant-based multivitamin. It is providing not just the vitamins that you see, A, E, D, K, C, the B vitamins, a whole host of B vitamins. It's providing very specific forms of those vitamins, so non-synthetic forms. And again, we can get into the whole laundry list of why certain synthetic vitamins are actually not necessarily particularly beneficial. But not only is it providing the natural forms of those vitamins, but again, it's providing other phytonutrients. It's providing, we make sure that we put in a whole host of minerals in there as well to support that aren't, again, just your calcium carbonate, for example. And when you think about that too, and I'm getting into a bit of a tangent here, I suppose, but you also have to think about how a supplement is crafted in terms of what's being put in as an excipient, because so many of them have excipients in them. And then even the forms of minerals or vitamins, and again, I said there are vitamins that are synthetic that are probably not necessarily great for us to take, but in addition, the minerals too, because that's something I think that really doesn't even get talked about, but minerals that are being put in commercial multivitamins that are things that will interfere with the absorption of everything else in the multivitamin. So why would you take a multivitamin that's going to continue to bind those same things you're trying to get out of the multivitamin so they pass through you essentially unabsorbed? You want something that is going to be absorbed, well, digested and absorbed, but nonetheless absorbed properly by the body and available then to be used. So again, we are very particular in our choice of the minerals that we see in there. So if it's something that isn't occurring naturally in that plant matrix and we're going to put some minerals in, for example, our peat blend, we want to make sure that it's something that's not going to interfere with the absorption of the other nutrients. So it's a multivitamin that's really crafted specifically to meet this laundry list, if you will, of things that need to be touched on. You need to have basically, you need to have the correct amounts of these nutrients, so we make sure that that's there. We make sure that being plant-derived, that they're there in their natural form. We then assure, as being plant-based, that you're going to get the other phytonutrients. Then we make sure that there's no interference with absorption. So if you can provide all of those things and provide them in a clean source, making sure that these things are tested for things like heavy metals, for mycotoxins, then you're also providing that last layer, which is making sure that it's completely safe and clean. If you can hit all of those, that's a good multivitamin. But as far as I've seen on the market, there's not a lot like that. And certainly when you get into the synthetics, you see these reports that are being published where they actually look at the mass-produced multivitamins and they see that these things may be providing nutrients, but a lot of them have high heavy metals. So they're not even necessarily giving you a full benefit if they're poisoning you too.
So catch-22, right, in that scenario. Well, would you argue, given the current food supply, I think most people, and this is seen in industry trends, consumers are, I think, quasi-aware, right, of the need for filling the gap that comes from, not nutrient-dense food, or, everybody has a quasi mess up day, right? Or cheat day, right? Where you don't get the best diet. And so
can we talk about The Rock? Can we talk about The Rock and his coronary artery disease and why his cheat days probably aren't the best move? I'm just saying.
Truth. We could. But it seems...
Sorry, Dwayne. I still love you, man. If you are watching this, I got your back.
With this, consumers are buying multivitamins, right? I think, over 3/4 of Americans have a multivitamin in their cabinet, right? Hopefully it's not, some of those multivitamins we won't name that, synthetics, heavy metal, toxin compromised. But is a multivitamin enough to address this deficiency that we're experiencing in the food supply?
Well, obviously the multivitamin is not going to be enough. It's providing things that you need. It's providing those vital amines, which was really where vitamins come from. It's providing you with those. It's providing you with some phytonutrients, but it's not replacing diet. It's a supplement. It's providing nutrients you need that you're not getting from your diet, but it does not entirely replace everything else either. The challenges of the world today, in addition to the depleted soil, the no longer as nutritive foods, there's a whole host of other things we're bombarded with daily. We are exposed to toxins that 100 years ago did not exist, literally did not exist.
And this is in the food supply.
It's everywhere, but it's in the food supply too. As a professional chemist, this is one of those things where it's sometimes hard for me to really get to that balance, which is the benefit of the synthetic chemicals that we have created over the last 100 years, which do provide benefits to mankind. But what are the drawbacks? what should we have done better? And now that we have hindsight on that, what can we do better when we develop new chemicals?
Yeah, I mean, and this is, I think, a really good tangent to maybe explore a little bit, because a lot of the chemicals that we've developed in the last 100 years, they shift the scales of the physiological system very dramatically, right? And they cause dramatic changes, which for our listeners maybe help them understand why that's not that beneficial.
So I don't even know where to start on this, because there are so many things that we've developed in the last 100 years that didn't exist prior, and so humans never would have been exposed to them at all prior to that. And I guess some of the ones that I'm thinking of currently, and obviously there's so many that are in the headlines right now. I mean, PFAS is the one, polyfluorinated alkylated substances. These compounds, their intention and the reason they were wonders when they were created is because of their ability to resist heat, to extinguish fires, to prevent sticking of materials. If not for things like PFAS, a lot of the medical devices, and specifically things that are more along the lines of intravenous delivery devices, could not have existed. That provided us with that ability. It also provided us with the ability to make products that otherwise couldn't have been made. And they're amazing chemicals. The problem is, in our excitement about chemicals and things that they can do, we often overlook the consequences of our actions. As I said before, it's just like with the soil depletion. We get so excited about these higher yielding fruits or vegetables that we forget there's probably something that's going to be a consequence for that choice. Well, the problem with things like PFAS is once they actually get absorbed into the human body, they interact with a number of systems. They interact with the immune system. They interact with our hormones. And they can cause incredible imbalances, especially in high amounts. And some people get exposed to very high amounts of these chemicals. And basically everybody in the world at this point has probably been exposed, at least anyone in the developed world has been exposed to these chemicals. They're in our systems right now. They keep running these tests. They pull blood from people and they find PFAS in human blood. Plastics in general, another thing that we have to deal with, which, no one ever would have thought 80 years ago that the plastic they were using was breaking down into billions of tiny, tiny, tiny little pieces, microscopic pieces, microplastics, nanoplastics, tiny little fragments, essentially, of the molecule. I mean, chains of the molecules, but very small pieces that would end up in the human body. And they become ubiquitous in the environment because they're so small that they can get carried by just about any means possible. And they end up in water, and then that water ends up in a field full of crops, and they're so small that they get taken up by the plants, and now they're in the plant tissue. And now you eat the plant tissue. Guess what? Now you have plastics inside you. You breathe them in because they're so small they can be carried in the air. You drink water, that same water that had them in them, now it's in you. You're getting exposed to these. And microplastics, essentially, and nanoplastics are being shown to do other similar things to what PFAS do. You see a lot of interaction with hormones and hormone receptors. You see interactions with the immune system. And the list just keeps growing by the day. And so if you're being exposed to these things through the food that you're eating, in addition to everywhere else, your body is being so heavily bombarded by toxins, which is what they really are, they're toxins, and your body is being bombarded so much that, again, it's not enough for a multivitamin is not going to fix or help counteract any of that. You may have enough phytonutrients in there to do some things, but you still need to have more phytonutrients in your body, other things, because, again, what's in the multi is not going to address every system. We know that. So now the question is, okay, what can someone do to try to decrease the absorption of these compounds? Because really, that's your first step, right? What's already in the system, to try to get it out can be very difficult. But can you prevent more from getting into your system, more from being absorbed by the body? And yes, you can. There's actually a number of proven ways to prevent PFAS and microplastics and things like that from actually being absorbed by the body. And one of those is something that we talk about quite a bit here at PRL, and that is bentonite clays, montmorillonite clays, clays that have adsorptive properties so that when they're ingested, they actually bind to those compounds and prevent them from being absorbed into the body. And that's really a wonderful thing, because you think about it, these clays are incredibly non-toxic. They're incredibly inert in terms of what they themselves do into the body. But they're able to bind these toxins so that you don't absorb them in your intestinal lumina and they don't get into your bloodstream. So there's a number of reports that have been published on using these clays to prevent the absorption of things like microplastics, PFAS, mycotoxins even, all sorts of different toxic chemicals. And so an adjunct to the diet in today's world that would really be beneficial to most people would probably be to incorporate some of these things. And our own MediClay FX provides that type of clay. And that's a wonderful way to help to really start to decrease that amount of just assault that is occurring to the body from all of these outside agents.
And of course, we have Medichlorella too, which has some additional benefits in that regard. Talking a little bit about Premier Quality, and I think, I do want to get into some practical strategies in addition to not only maybe taking a multivitamin, looking at additional foundational products that really can be implemented into a regime to maybe address gaps. But, I really wanted to also look at the aspect from a Premier Quality angle, how we define nutrient density for the product, for the ingredients that we actually use in our products, right? I think that's an important aspect, that most dietary supplement manufacturers, they don't actually go to a degree of defining the raw material quality that then goes into that finished product, right? Sure. So, when we think about the state of the food supply, there's no grocery store or grocery buyer that's, testing the apples and saying this apple has this amount of vitamin C or pectin or whatever beneficial nutrient derivative. But the thing is, with a dietary supplement, we're making usually a claim on the label saying that there's a certain active in there, but there's also additional actives that come from a whole food matrix. And I know we here at Premier Research Labs, we really pride ourselves on really defining raw material quality. So can you maybe illuminate areas that we go above and beyond to define that?
Sure. So one of the things that we're very, I'll say, committed to is making sure that when we receive raw materials, not only do we test them for the potency of the active that we want to claim on the label, not only do we test them for contamination by things like heavy metals, mycotoxins, various dangerous microbes. I mean, we run the gamut of those tests. But typically speaking, in the background, one of the things the R&D team really prides itself on is quantifying other compounds in there, not only for the identification, to make sure that, this isn't just a very small sample of what we're looking for that's been spiked or doped with something that's an active to try to fool us. We actually like to test to see if other marker compounds are actually there that would occur in that natural plant matrix, to make sure that what we're getting really is that plant matrix and it's providing all of those other phytochemicals that are the signatures, if you will, of that plant. We do this for all of our botanicals because there is a pretty prevalent finding in this supplement world of ours that we can confirm. I've seen it myself multiple times, where you do get a sample of, say, I like to use turmeric as the example. Turmeric, because it became so popular, tends to lend itself to these situations. But you buy turmeric, and the sample you actually receive in, the material you purchased, is turmeric, no doubt. But in a lot of cases, you'll get something where it's turmeric that has degraded so much. So it's maybe an old turmeric, or somebody extracted actives out of this and felt that they can sell the mark or the dried leftover plant material as turmeric, which, let's say, I mean, it's turmeric, but it's turmeric minus all of the important active compounds. So you get this material in. There are a lot of companies out there that would buy this material. All they would do is they would test to see if there were curcuminoids in it. Probably not even quantifying them, just seeing the presence of. Well, a lot of these companies will extract and they will just dope a little bit, just enough so that they know if someone runs an HPLC analysis on it, that they're going to find some curcuminoids. Good enough, right? We can't accept that. We really can't accept that. We have to make sure that when we get that material, it tests at a certain level of curcuminoids that would naturally occur in the plant. But in addition, that the other marker compounds in turmeric are there when we test it. At appreciable amounts, meaning at the amounts you would see if you fresh harvested, or at least harvested and dried this material naturally and didn't extract it, didn't let it sit in a warehouse or open to the elements, even worse, for months or even years. And we know what those numbers are, so we can test to that and we can confirm that. And that's really why premier quality is premier quality. I don't even know how many people outside of the company realize how much material we reject, how much material we throw away, we scrap. We tell these vendors we can't take this material. We try to educate them as well, because a lot of vendors really don't know. If they're buying from a farm and something happened on that farm, the material, they may not be aware. So in this process, we also try to educate the vendors, the suppliers, the farmers, if we can get to that level, and let them understand, hey, we're looking for these things. These are the marker compounds. These are the compounds that indicate premier quality. We want to make sure that we're always getting material of premier quality. And so that's our ethos. That's our guiding principle, and that's really what Dr. Marshall intended for our company.
Yeah, it really is the resounding statement of like what our mission and intention is. And I think, it is a scary thing. Once I started working here at Premier and the journey of Premier quality, it opened, my eye to just why, there is no true definition of nutrient quality in our food supply, honestly. And then you even take that to supplements, and that's a whole nother world, right? But we really peel back the iterative layers of understanding the botanical compounds that we bring in, and I feel that's the most important thing anybody that's working in the botanical industry really should be vigilant about. So kind of going back to the whole food paradigm and the food supply, talking practical strategies, right? We mentioned Mediclay, we mentioned having a really good multivitamin. Where else can a consumer or health professionals listening in really drive results with clients that may not have access to shopping at really farmers markets or really good grocery stores that carry really good produce? How else can a consumer or a health professional really take charge of the nutrient density of the foods that they're eating?
So one thing I definitely wanted to touch on, because this really sort of opens that door, is fermented foods. One of the guiding principles that Dr. Marshall also had was the benefit of incorporating fermented foods into the diet. And fermented foods offer so many benefits. And it's amazing that now mainstream nutrition advocates are finally really catching on to this just in the last few years. But fermented foods have this plethora of benefits that they offer to the consumer. And that's everything from the pre-digestion and this initial breakdown of starting material. You see it particularly in plant matrices, where this breakdown by bacteria and other microorganisms, fermentation will actually allow for better access to the nutrients inside, because it's pre-digesting some of the cell wall structure that isn't necessarily providing benefit. I mean, it's providing fiber, but a lot of the cell wall structure essentially is not nutritive to a human. But by breaking down that cellular structure further, the fermentation process allows access to what's inside that structure. And that's what's important. So it provides a more readily available source of the nutrients. In addition, you get the beneficial compounds that are produced as postbiotics by those same bacteria and fungus or whatever you may have been using in your fermentation media. Here we pride ourselves on bacterial fermentation, obviously, and bacteria produce this host of interesting compounds that are beneficial as postbiotics. But if you're going to really try to maximize the effect of the food that you're getting, especially if it's something, when you look at it, okay, fermented foods, so fermentation process, but fermented foods are very shelf stable. And they're essentially, it's a way of preserving foods. But it's so interesting that not only do they preserve that food, but they actually enhance, in many cases, the nutrient density, and they also make the nutrients more bioavailable. So again, who wouldn't want to have that combination? To me, that seems like the ultimate combination, actually. I can get this host of other compounds that weren't even in the food to begin with, and now I have more nutrients in that, while providing something that still has its innate nutrients from the plant. So something like our fermented turmeric and ginger, for example, or our fermented greens, is providing the benefits not only of the turmeric and the ginger or the greens, but it's providing those postbiotics produced in the fermentation process. So again, you're getting more nutrients than you would have gotten otherwise, and it's in a convenient format as well. So again, I've always been an advocate for fermented foods. And if you can add fermented foods to your diet, along with, if you need a multivitamin to provide things you're not getting there, you've got a multi, you've got fermented foods, trying to be very educated and aware of the other foods that you are taking in. Top that off with some clay, a medi-clay, to prevent the absorption of harmful compounds that, again, we're being bombarded with daily. And you're really getting a recipe for more success in life. And that's one of those wonderful things that I think Premier Research Labs does so well, is not just providing fermented options, but also trying to educate about why the fermented option is beneficial and why you might be getting something more from that than you would be getting just from taking a turmeric or a ginger, as a supplement.
Yeah, I agree. And we also keep in mind, a lot of the products that we offer allow for the body's physiological systems to operate more efficiently, right? So, you talk about organ-gland systems and how are they ideally nourished to perform certain functions in the body, right? And so this is where botanicals and herbals that target very specific areas of the body come into play, because we're providing key nutrient derivatives that those particular cells may need to thrive, right? And so this is where we can really start to, really optimize how, when you're consuming foods that, obviously maybe have been washed with medi-clay, which you can open the capsules of medi-clay and do a nice food wash if you want, and take it internally. Great protection for any potential pesticides, herbicides, aflatoxins, right? Washing that off. But also we can help optimize how the body's then utilizing those nutrients, because we have additional products that can help to really support appropriate action of certain organ gland systems, right? Which I think is beautiful, right? That creates harmony, right?
Oh, yes.
Is there any other products that you really like to recommend or bring awareness around in the Premier Research Labs line that, really fit into the kind of this paradigm of addressing?
Wow. There's just supply. So many. There are so many here. I'm such an advocate for taking it as close to whole food as possible anyway, that one of the things that I really enjoy about our products, and the one that we've sort of talked about a little bit in recent podcasts here, we just introduced it in a much larger container, which is great because it can be used daily, and typically people will use a larger dose, is the whey protein. It has become so difficult to find an organic whey protein. It's amazing that, for something that was seen 10 to 15, maybe 20 years ago as this, that the whey protein was essentially something you'd find really only in a health food store. You wouldn't find it on your major shelves in a big box supermarket. That now you find whey protein everywhere. And again, it looks like the same bad situation that we just talked about with crops is starting to occur with things like whey protein, even where the push has been simply for quantity over quality. So now everybody has a whey protein, and there's very few organic whey proteins. There's very few with a guaranteed analysis of the amino acids. There's probably not too many out there that aren't contaminated with something. Heavy metals, mycotoxins, certainly pathogenic bacteria. I mean, the quality overall of whey protein that I have seen on the market has deteriorated significantly definitely in the last 10 years, because it's just everywhere. And so again, the push was for quantity. Whereas our whey protein, it is still organic. We know the source. We run the analysis on it. We make sure that not only is this protein clear of any kind of contamination, but we make sure that it has a guaranteed nutritional profile that is typical of a grass-fed, well-maintained cow. I mean, essentially, that's what it comes down to. How was the animal treated in optimal conditions, under optimal feeding conditions? You know what the typical breakdown would be in terms of the amino acid profile of whey. And so we want to make sure that when we get that material, it still meets that optimal profile, so that it's not something where someone is trying to, essentially under a starvation diet, force the cattle to produce whey protein. Because you can do that. There are ways to manipulate a diet. But we want to make sure that this is closer to that optimal signature diet that we can trace through the chemical analysis to say, okay, we know that this has been a well-treated animal. We know that this animal's diet has been, closer to what is an optimal diet for the animal, rather than, unfortunately, what you see in some of this mass production, these cows that are put in these tiny little pens, eating a, corn-based diet, which is not normal for a ruminant. All of these things that are just really, in the end, very sad, and which are degrading to the animal and to humans. And in the end, it's really just, it's a shame to see those sorts of things, and to see that there's this lack of respect for the entire system overall, and in the name of profit.
As we kind of wrap up here, because I feel like we could go down so many different rabbit holes, and I know you will be back here, Nathan, to share more insights. How can consumers, health professionals listening in, really start to help to shift policy, help to shift kind of how big food is engaged in the growing of food and our food supply? What can an average consumer do to really start to manifest change in the world today, so that 50 years from now we're not eating the slurry of vitamins? Like our food supply is not just from a tube. Mm-hmm. It's still grown from Mother Earth, and it's really providing that pristine source of nourishment and nutrient profile that really creates resiliency that we've talked about.
So I can think of 3 really great ways that people can sort of get involved in this. The first way, I think, is the sort of, maybe it's a little more of a canned response, but I still think it's incredibly important, which is advocate as much as possible with your representatives in government. As everyone knows, government tends to listen to the loudest voice in the room. And unfortunately, the loudest voice in the room right now is the voice that comes along with the biggest suitcase full of cash. And let's face it, that's the fact. They are the loudest voice in the room. They have the most people in Washington lobbying for them, and that's big agra. And so being the voice that you can, your community, to your representatives, to make sure that you can get as much noise made in Washington, at your local level, in the state, whatever, as much as you can, advocate for a clean, healthy food supply.
This is the time to do it.
This is the time to do it. It looks like there's some movement right now in that direction, which, again, I think this is a really opportune time for us. And maybe in many ways, this is, if we don't act now, we could be in big trouble. You know, and that includes things that are tangential, specifically say, okay, the food supply is one thing. We didn't even touch on the effect of climate change on the food supply. This could be an entire podcast on its own, so I'm not going to get into it right now. But there's a very detrimental effect to increasing CO2 on the nutritive value in foods. So advocate as well for, as much as you can, advocate for control of climate change. There's a lot we can do individually, and there's a lot you can do as being a voice to try to push for that as well in legislation, because we really need to try to control this climate condition that we're facing right now as much as we can. So that was my first thing. Advocate. 2, use your purchasing power. When you are buying, buy those things from high quality producers. Buy the highest quality, highest nutritional food that you can. A lot of this requires, unfortunately, educating yourself as much as possible too, but if you can and you have that ability, and practitioners, I speak to the practitioners here because you are the ones who are educated. Use your purchasing power, inform your patients to use their purchasing power as well. The more you drive to that small producer, high quality food, as the money goes there, so people will open their eyes. So continue pushing in that direction.
And not to interrupt, I think it's important to add that, you know, a lot of times when people are looking at organic, nutrient dense, grass fed, you know, all these different, you know, kind of tags that kind of say, hey, this is high quality. It's important to have the conversation that the processed food actually per ounce could be more expensive than the grass fed or the organic food that you're looking to purchase. And then when we think about the long-term consequences or outcomes of choosing healthy, sustainable, the ideal options versus the processed, you know, that seem cheaper.
Yes.
You can kind of factor in, you know, from a price economics perspective, it actually saves money in the long run.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So again, I mean, there's so much this purchasing power that, again, that could be its own podcast. I think each of the things I'm going to touch on could be a podcast, but definitely use your purchasing power because, as they say, money talks. And then the third one is really getting back down to this very, very grassroots thing, which is try to grow food at home. Have your own garden. Have a victory garden in this case. This case, it's victory over big agra. You know, grow as much as you can if you can at home. Advocate for patients to grow food at home if they can. A window box garden even if they can, to grow herbs. I mean, there are so many little things you can do with trying to grow things at home to add nutrient value to what you're eating. If you can grow a window box of herbs, picking the ones that are typically the highest in nutrient value. I mean, I'm thinking cilantro. If you're okay with cilantro, I love cilantro, but a lot of people don't. You know, chives are always great. Parsley, any kind of parsley. All of these herbs that you can grow in a window box that take up very little space and use nothing but a little soil and water essentially to get them going. Or if you can actually have a garden, you know, grow a garden, or see if you can get involved with a community garden. I grew up in Chicago, so I know that area very well. And one of the things that was really being pushed right around the time when I left Chicago was the idea of community gardens in underserved areas, taking over these abandoned lots where tenements had been ripped down and turning them into community gardens and being able to actually grow food right there in an urban environment, but growing food with, you know, again, they were using organic soils. They were teaching people the process of growing healthful, nutritious food. And again, this is a very small thing. You don't even think that this can make an impact, but you'd be shocked how much it makes an impact when you eat that food from your own garden and you taste the difference between, you know, again, I do melons, and I can tell you right now that the melon from my garden tastes so much better than that mass-produced melon at the store. Watermelon, cantaloupe, it doesn't matter. The flavor is just so much better. It's been tended with love. It's been tended with care. you take care of it yourself and you make sure that you grow that the best you can, like any good farmer would, and that's really that stewardship of the earth. And yeah, in the end, there is nothing in my mind more delicious than the fruits and vegetables that I grow in my garden.
That intention ends up in the food that you eat 100%.
Love comes back.
It does. Nathan Dodge, thank you so much for your wisdom and just being a steward of premier quality and really just a steward for, health around the world. For all those that listened in, thank you so much for your time and joining us on this Premier Living podcast episode. I know we will be back with Nathan in the very near future, but if you have any suggestions or would like to reach out to even be on the Premier Living podcast, feel free to do so. And once again, we'll look forward to catching you next time.